This is the Fifth Estate Winning Headlines, your media police post. In this segment, we summarize some of the headlines that you may have missed this morning, but we also take a look at the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country. Today is the 30th of April 2021, and I am 2J.
I'm 2M.
I am CS.
So in case you missed the headlines, here they are. In the Daily Nation, who killed these men? In the Standard, who killed them? And in the Star, Harish Patel, cremation is a higher calling. So clearly there is absolutely no news today. So I guess we'll take it upon ourselves to set the agenda for the weekend, right?
Absolutely.
CS, take us off.
Headlines are a little bland. Rest in peace to those men. But I'd like to depart from today's headlines because there's something I simply must address. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about judicial independence. And sure enough, it is an important pillar. It is an essential factor to having a judiciary that works in a tripartite system of government, where you have the executive, legislature, and the judiciary, and in effect, a system of checks and balances. But what has been bothering me about all the talk of judicial independence is the sense in which it is being held almost as an end in itself.
Yes.
I bet you if you ask most people who talk about judicial independence why it is so important, they would be hard-pressed to give you a clear or coherent answer. Some will tell you that it is important because it is in the Constitution. But once upon a time, one-party rule was enshrined in the Constitution.
Oh, yes.
Why did we celebrate when it was repealed? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that we should repeal Article 160 on judicial independence. I maintain that it is integral. But the argument that I would, however, like to advance is that judicial independence is not an end in itself and needs to be put in its proper context.
Yes.
Judicial independence is necessary because it underpins the rule of law in contrast to a rule by men, which is the legacy of absolute monarchs and dictators. If the rule of law is to be enforced fairly and even-handedly, if no one is to be above the law, then judges must be able to render decisions impartially and without undue influence.
Yes.
What judicial independence is not, however, is a system where the judiciary is left entirely to its own devices and judges can impose their contemplation of morality on the whole country. It must be remembered that ultimately the judiciary is established in service to the people. That is why Article 159 declares that judicial authority is derived from the people. And because the judiciary exercises a power granted to them by the people and for the people, judicial independence must therefore be counterbalanced with judicial accountability.
Yes.
That is why the BBI bill proposes an ombudsman to ensure that litigants have a recourse in instances where there is unethical conduct by judicial officers.
Absolutely.
The people need to be able to call out the judiciary when they perceive the slightest iota of rot in the corridors of the Palace of Justice. Secondly, you also need to have a head of the judiciary who understands that country is paramount. We should never again have a Chief Justice who would see the country burn because of convoluted personal beliefs and who fails to understand that a system of laws is established for the sake of society, not the other way around. We should never again suffer a Chief Justice without a good grounding in jurisprudence, because the net effect is a judiciary that is intellectually inelegant and which results in retrogression. Going forward as a country, we must always seek to have a Chief Justice with a coherent theory of justice. To quote Professor Mutahi Ngunyi, a judiciary is as elegant as its Chief Justice. We submit that Justice Martha Koome is a right choice for Chief Justice. She is good for country. This came out clearly during the interviews when Justice Majanja put her to task on why she presided on a case after hours. She responded by saying that if they didn't have that sitting, it would have resulted in a constitutional crisis because the presidential elections would not have otherwise happened. This tells us that she is mindful of the consequences of judicial decisions. Consequentialism is a theory of justice.
Very well
true.
put. Very well put.
Yeah, and I think I'm just going to carry on with part of what I said yesterday, but also adding on to what CS has very well put together. Because yesterday I said that looking at Kenya's constitution, it is very clear where we have gone wrong as a country. I spoke about the specific rights that the constitution gives to its citizens, but also how those rights do not represent us as a multi-ethnic nation. But today, I want to talk about the relationship between the three arms of government, because even here, much is wrong. I want to submit that there is a gross imbalance between those three organs. The executive is frustrated, the judiciary is overworked, and parliament is asleep. We have become a country that constitutionalizes and litigates everything. The courts have become the first rather than the last resort. The role of parliament is to represent the electorate, make laws, and oversee the government. But since parliament has become almost irrelevant for resolving any major issues, the courts have now become the new battlefield.
Yeah.
And the problem with this is how we become dependent, or how dependent we have become on litigation to solve issues of the moment. Umtata goes to court, questioning the qualifications of CJ nominees, forces a ruling from the court that will haunt us for years. This is just an example.
Absolutely.
But the danger of a litigious society is in running to have every problem answered by a binding court decision.
Oh, yeah.
In seeking answers for everything, it leaves nothing left for the intentions and for meaning. This is not sustainable.
Absolutely.
An unrestricted reliance on case law and precedent, rather than giving space for interpretation of meaning, will make us a country of fools.
Oh, yeah.
So I end with a word of advice for the courts as they enter into a new season of leadership. The Supreme Court should not become the third chamber of parliament,
Yes.
robbing the National Assembly of its job and function.
Yeah.
Instead, the court should begin to develop some theory of adjudication, or theory of justice, as CS put it, that can be long-standing and beneficial to the country without bothering every other arm.
Fantastic.
And so on that note, we have a three-part criteria that we look at as we look at the headlines. We ask ourselves, are the headlines topical or speculative, repetitive or groundbreaking, or thoughtful or just plain lazy? I would like to suggest that we toss all
of
three
them.
headlines
Absolutely.
while 2M rounds out the week for us, right?
Absolutely. Hey, wow.
Okay, wow.
It's like you got a
Those headlines
master's,
made you angry.
masters in throwing headlines. Anyway, throughout this week, I've been thinking to myself how such a savvy and shrewd group of people called Kikuyus have been conned by William RUTO. I mean, how can a people who are known as great swindlers be swindled so easily? It's a thing that has puzzled me completely. But when you read about a guy called Anthony Kinyak, you will understand why RUTO's Houdini game is A1. You see, Anthony Kinyak went by the name Sultan bin Khalid Al Saud. For 30 plus years, Kinyak masqueraded as Saudi royalty to support a lavish lifestyle that included Ferraris with fake plates, wrist full of Rolexes and Cartier bracelets, a penthouse on Fisher Island, and a posh chihuahua named Foxy. And the guy flaunted it all on his Instagram page. Like most con artists, the guy had a framework on how to con. He picked his targets well. They had to be wealthy, good looking, and famous. And he liked them like that because he could use them to attract other rich people. I mean, if you saw a group of wealthy, good-looking people, you'd want to join their company, right?
Okay.
He'd meet established architects or designers and tell them, oh, you could have done many of my friends' palaces in the Middle East. If you looked the part, he'd play the part. He'd speak to your heart and desires, charm you with gifts, tell you that he'd love to invest in your business. Now, one day, Kinyak, posing as Sultan bin Khalid Al Saud, met Jeffrey Sofa, a billionaire who owned Fontainebleau, a six-star Miami hotel, and told him that he'd want to invest over $400 million in exchange for a 30% stake in his hotel. As they were chatting, this Kinyak guy decided to order a pizza. Guess what pizza he ordered? Guess what pizza the Sultan ordered? He ordered a prosciutto.
Yeah.
A pizza with ham and mushrooms. Would you imagine a Muslim ordering a pizza with ham?
Right.
Immediately, Sofa became suspicious. This was Kinyak's fatal tell. The State Department was notified about his wicked ways, and Kinyak was arrested and charged and jailed for 18 years for fraud, forgery, amongst many other charges. What's my point here? The fake Sultan reminds me of RUTO. Just like his targets, Kikuyus bought into the RUTO con game hook, line, and sinker. Ruto has romanced these Kikuyus. He's showered them with gifts, told them he'll make them wealthier than Uhuru ever made them. And Kikuyus have bought it. He has told them that he made Uhuru president, and they have believed him. But soon, just like the fake Sultan was, he will be exposed. If the fake Sultan was caught eating ham and bacon, Ruto too will be caught having Muratina in church. No con ever gets away with their crimes. Some way, somehow, they always blunder. And the Ruto blunder isn't too far away.
In fact, in a way, I think it's already here.
Yeah.
The harm in Ruto's pizza is he's preaching bottom-up economics and hustlers when he's flying in helicopters.
Yeah.
That's the harm.
That's the ham and bacon.
So, on that note, I guess we have no winning headline and no cartoons today, so no winning cartoon.
And now our final thought. It is inspired by a book entitled The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe.
But before that, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, to like, and to switch on notifications. Now, all through this week, before we get to today's book, we've been looking at extraordinary voyages and expeditions. On Tuesday, as we'd like to remind you, our final thought was inspired by the book Endurance, Shackleton's Incredible Voyage by Alfred Lansing. This book is about the failure of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition led by Sir Ernest Shackleton in its attempt to cross the Antarctic continent in 1914. We talked about how this story is a testament to man being tested to his limits, the importance of experienced leadership and planning for contingencies. On Wednesday, we looked at the quest by Sir Henry Morton Stanley and American journalists to find England's most celebrated explorer, David Livingstone, who had vanished in Africa on an expedition to find the source of the River Nile. We use the book Into Africa, The Epic Adventures of Stanley and Livingstone by Martin Dugard to trace the incredible journey of Livingstone up until Stanley found him in Tanzania and uttered the famous words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." And on Thursday, our final thought was inspired by the book The Lost City of Z, A Tale of Deadly Obsession in the Amazon by David Gran. The book takes us on the journey of Percy Fawcett as he ventured into the Amazon to find an ancient civilization, hoping to make one of the most important discoveries in history. He hoped to find the world's largest jungle concealed kingdom, the glittering kingdom of El Dorado. The story of Colonel Percy Fawcett leaves more unanswered questions than any other extraordinary voyage. Did Fawcett find what he was seeking? Was Kuhikugu the lost city of Z? And did he find it? We'll never know.
So now back to the book for today. The Right Stuff is an account of the early American space program and its roots in military test pilots. So the book combines numerous elements: technological advancements in the mid-20th century flight, daring pilots who pushed innovations to their limits, and reflections on the moral, cultural, and political significance of the first astronauts during the Cold War. So this combination provides a unique portrait of a major episode in modern American history. And this book focuses on the first astronauts that NASA chose to send into space. And the author closely examines how these men were selected and what happened during their time in Project Mercury, which I will get to, as well as the public's reaction to them. Also, he looks at each of these men individually, including their family lives and relationships with one another. So Project Mercury was the first human space flight program of the United States. And the program had two aims. One, to see if humans could function effectively in space. And two, to put a man in space before the Soviet Union did.
Yes.
So while the Mercury project failed on the second aim, I think we all know that the Soviet Union got to space before the US did.
Yes.
It did provide the technological basis for a more challenging mission. So at the time of publication, the American pride was in shambles.
Yes.
And there was nothing to be proud of after President Nixon's unceremonious exit and the colossal failure of the Vietnam War. So Wolfe, the author, opens the book with an ode to the test pilots and the tremendous sacrifice and loss that this dangerous duty can bring to the loved ones that you leave behind. So focusing his eye on the space race and the emergence of the space program, Wolfe revitalizes American heroism through these 7 exceptional astronauts and engineers who brought glory back to the American flag. And the book follows the first attempt at breaking the sound barrier. And so these test pilots were willing to put their lives on the line to achieve this monumental milestone. And he explores, the author, American heroes that dared to pursue the unknown, like Chuck Yeager, Alan Shepard, and John Glenn, among other great pilots and astronauts, who are the true driving force of this book. And if anything, as I read this book, it really reminded me of how critical patriotism is. Because in my view, I think that even when Americans are divided politically, there's still some key truths that they all agree on when it comes to their country. And I sometimes wonder if Kenyans just enjoy complaining about things but never looking at the bigger picture.
Oh, yeah.
But more so, does it have something to do with our identity as Kenyans? Maybe we only boast about our greatness when we're in another country, but when we're at home, all we ever do is, complain about what's happening. My question is, where's the patriotism at home? I think that's a very important question that I would want to know, and what this week really kind of brought, out to me.
It's actually a truism that nothing unites a country more than an external enemy.
Oh, fantastic.
Do we have any external enemies?
COVID.
It's like you knew what I was going to say, 2J. Now, on October 4th, 1957, 10 years minus 10 days after Yeager broke the sound barrier, the Soviet Union sent Sputnik into orbit. Sputnik. Yes, Kenyans, Sputnik wasn't just a vaccine. Anyway, panic followed the Soviets' first foray into space. It appeared to the people of the United States and their government that the control of the heavens was at stake, and an effort to launch an American into space to close the gap with the Soviets began immediately. After lengthy consideration about how to select the first American in space, at one point the field was actually to be open to any young male college graduate with experience in dangerous pursuits, be it mountain climbers or deep sea divers or skydivers and the like. Now, President Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered that the first astronauts be chosen from the ranks of the military test pilots. And this was because military test pilots had a high possibility of death. And this was actually part of their contract with the US government. In fact, Tom Wolfe tells us of a Navy study showing that for a career Navy pilot, there was a 23% probability that he would die in an aircraft accident. And this did not even include combat deaths, since the military did not classify death in combat as accidental.
Wow.
But more importantly, the government had no right to ask civilians to assume the risks of flying to space or to sponsor flights on which civilians who do assume those risks are passengers. In fact, when the original 7 Mercury astronauts, Project Mercury astronauts were being selected, they were told in very specific terms, hazardous undertaking, strictly volunteer. If you don't volunteer, it will not be held against you. In my view, this was a very sensible thing by Eisenhower. And I say that because many don't know that President Eisenhower was actually a pilot.
Oh, really?
Yes. Now, according to his presidential museum, he learned to fly while he was stationed in the army in the Philippines as a lieutenant colonel. I think that's a great story.
It is a great story. Yeah, and it shows how a president, knowing what skills he has, is able to impact his own country for the better, right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
I wonder what someone who steals land would impact skills to.
He would definitely not be able to digitize the land registry. I can tell you that.
There we go.
I'm sure.
Great response, yes.
I'm sure he'd like it manual.
What I found most gripping about the book is how it captured what it takes to be a military pilot, the qualities, the possibilities, and the very real perils. As Tuam said, there was a 23% probability that a Navy pilot would die in an aircraft accident, and this statistics didn't even include combat deaths, since they didn't classify death as accidental, death in combat, that is.
Absolutely.
Furthermore, there was a 56% probability that at some point in their career, a Navy pilot, military pilot, would have to eject from the aircraft and attempt to come down by parachute.
56%.
56%
That's
probability.
High. Wow.
That's high.
And in the era of jet fighters, what makes this a statistic even more stark is ejection meant being exploded out of the cockpit by a nitroglycerin charge, like a human cannonball.
Wow.
The ejection itself was so hazardous, men lost knees, arms, and their lives on the rim of the cockpit.
Wow.
Or they had the skin torn off their faces when they hit the wall of air outside.
Whoa.
In light of this reality, many pilots chose to instead wrestle the aircraft to the ground and die that way instead.
Ooh.
So what implications did this perils and possibilities have in terms of the qualities required of a military pilot? A young man might go into military flight training, wasn't simply going into a technical school to acquire a certain set of skills. Instead, he found himself in a fraternity where men were not rated by their outward rank as captains, lieutenants, commanders, etc. Also, remember when this book was written, as we refer to men, it was in the 80s.
1973, I believe.
So here, the world was divided into those who had it and those who did not. This quality, this je ne sais quoi, was never named, but it obviously involved bravery.
Yes.
But was not bravery in the simple sense of being willing to risk your life. Any fool could do that if all that was required was throwing away your life. You know, the idea here seemed to be having the ability to go up in a hurtling piece of machinery and put one's life on the line and rely on instinct, reflexes, experience, and coolness. And then to go up again the next day, and the next day, and every next day, even if the series should prove infinite. And ultimately, in its best expression, do so in a cause that means something to thousands, to a people, a nation, to humanity, to God even, depending on your beliefs. But there was no test to show whether or not a pilot had this righteous quality. There was instead a seemingly infinite series of tests that demonstrated that you were the one of the anointed, who had the right stuff and who had the capacity to bring tears to men's eyes, the very brotherhood of the right stuff itself. The theme that persistently animated my thoughts as I considered this was that inherent in our design as humans lies the answers to our calling. We need to examine our lives to discern the right stuff in each of us. Tragically, if we do not properly attune ourselves to seeking this within ourselves, then we will be ill prepared to heed to our life's true calling. This observation reminded me of the trial of Socrates and what he said that has echoed throughout history, that the unexamined life is not worth living. He told his accusers that rather than cease his pursuit of truth, if it meant that he would die, then he would rather continue his pursuit of truth in the afterlife.
Beautiful.
Wow.
Beautiful.
Yeah, this has indeed been a very interesting week. And so I think I'll just leave you with a short quote that might sum up some thoughts about voyages and extraordinary, what did you call them, CS? The journeys, we'll go with that.
Voyages.
And it comes from, it's a little poem from somebody called Robert Brownings. He says, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp. Or what's a heaven for? And it's quite tricky, but I think that the gist of it is suggesting to achieve anything worthwhile, a person should attempt even those things that may turn out to be impossible. I think that's such a powerful note to end on. So on a day when we had no winning headline or no winning cartoon, I want to remind you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also find us on Pang, Free to Air, GoTV, and Star Times. Have a lovely weekend. We'll see you on Monday.